SvelteKit Authentication with Github OAuth. Hi, I'm Tom Wilson, and today we're going to do a little workshop. In this workshop, we will create a SvelteKit app and showcase its authentication using Github OAuth, which could work with any OAuth or any authentication. I think it'll give you an idea of how authentication can work with SvelteKit using cookie-based HTTP only kind of session management. So in this tutorial, you're going to learn how to create OAuth application using GitHub, how to redirect requests using SvelteKit, how to handle OAuth callbacks in SvelteKit, how to use the access token to get user information with GitHub, how to store HTTP only cookies using SvelteKit, how to use the hooks middleware using SvelteKit, and finally, how to read session information back in the SvelteKit client. So how to take it from the server and pass it to your client. So with all that, that's what we'll learn today. There's a couple of caveats. One, this is June 2nd, and SvelteKit is still in beta, so some of these things may change in the future. But this is the current state of SvelteKit as of June 2nd. What you should know before you take this workshop. Number one, you should be familiar with JavaScript. Should know a little bit about the fetch API. So we're going to use the fetch API quite a bit. And if you don't really know how to use it, I have a link to go check out the documentation of fetch. And we'll be using version 14 of Node.js. So let's make sure. Version 14.17. And finally, you'll want to have a GitHub account. So we're going to use GitHub OAuth, and one of the requirements to create an OAuth application is to use a GitHub account. All right, so getting started, we're going to use Visual Studio, and we're actually using gitpod.io. Gitpod.io is a great toolkit. It allows you to run your development environment in the cloud using Visual Studio Code, a terminal, and Git. It's amazing, and it works in sync with your GitHub repository. So you can create a little button in the GitHub by installing an extension, and every time you click that button, it'll launch Gitpod, launch a project in Gitpod.io. Definitely encourage you to check that out. It's made my life much simpler. So getting started, we're going to use the Svelte command line. And again, since SvelteKit is in beta, the command line, we're going to create Svelte using npm init and give it the @next tag. So the @next tag will let us know that we're still in beta. So on your terminal, in an empty directory, here we have a directory, call it whatever you want, but create an empty directory. And then in that directory, you want to run npm init, which is going to look for a create svelte package on npm and run it. So we're going to init svelte @next, and this will basically find the latest package on npm, and it's going to ask us some questions. So the first question is, the directory not empty, do we want to continue? And the answer is yes, we want to continue. Then the second one will be, which Svelte app template do we use? And we're going to use the skeleton project. The skeleton project will just basically give us an empty app The SvelteKit demo app is awesome. It has some great kind of example code in there, but for this, we're just going to use the skeleton project. And we're going to just say no to TypeScript, no to ESLint, and no to prettier. Okay, so now we've got a app kind of set up for Svelte, so we can just do Yarn. You could use npm install, but I am really used to using Yarn, so we'll use Yarn to pull down all the dependencies and build, and then we can use Yarn dev to run our application. Now with Gitpod, I'm going to open this in the preview window, which should give us a little browser view of the app. And we're going to set that to the side. Let's see. Oops. See if I can move it to the right. Like that. Whoa. Cool. Well, let's do this. Let's open up a file that we're going to be working on. Let's go ahead and just open up routes index.svelte and then split the screen and then launch the browser. So we'll launch the browser preview. There we go. All right, so now we got a nice little split screen, and we can say welcome to Svelte Auth, save, and we refresh. We can see this now. The hot module reload is not quite set up here, but it will reload as you'll see. But there's a little trick with Gitpod to get all the WebSockets firing, but we're not going to worry about that right now because we're going to focus on auth. So the next thing we want to do is create a new GitHub OAuth application. The easiest way to do that is go to GitHub and go to your icon and go to settings, and it will default you to a profile page. What you want to do is click developer settings, click on OAuth apps, and then new OAuth app, and just give it a name. I'm going to call mine Authy because that sounds cute, but give it a name. And then what we want to do is give it a homepage URL and a callback. So our homepage URL, we're going to just do HTTP localhost 3000. And then the callback, we're going to do HTTP localhost 3000/callback, like that. And we're going to register the application. And that will take you to the application view screen. And what we want to do is get the client ID. So we want to copy this number here. And we'll just do copy. And then we'll go to our terminal. And I'm going to create we'll go to our file folders in VS Code, and we'll create a new file in the root directory. So we want to be in the root directory, do new file, and we'll call it .env. And in that .env file, we'll open it up, stick it on the tab here, and we're going to type byte client ID equals, and then we're going to paste that ID in there. Now we're using the prefix byte because SvelteKit's built on byte, and in order for us to see the environment variables, we need to use byte. And then we're going to add another one. We'll call it byte.client secret equals. And we're going to go back to our OAuth application and we're going to click generate a new client secret. Okay. Enter in your password and anything else, and it's going to generate this new secret. We're going to hit the clipboard icon because we want to copy it to our clipboard. And then we're going to go back to our editor and we're going to paste that secret in just like that. Okay. And save that file and close it. So now we've got our environment settings set up for our app. And that will make sense once we start to do the authentication. Okay. I'm going to end my server and I'm just going to create a branch really quick. So got get status and we're going to add some stuff. We're going to add .get ignore. I'm going to add the README. I'm going to add JS config and add package JSON, the source directory, static directory, and the config file, and yarn.log. Okay. So really the only thing we didn't want to add is .env and the npm-rc, which we could add that if we wanted to. So we're going to create a branch by checking out -b, and we're going to call this branch setup. And we'll just do 1-setup. I think that'll work. Okay, and we're going to commit all of our code. First code, wanted to say first commit. Oh well. You'll get the gist, right? The status. And now we're going to push to that branch. We'll use get branch, show current. That way I don't have to remember what branch it is. I can just type that and it's going to push to the branch. Sweet. So that's our setup. And now what we want to do is create our login button. So we're going to run yarn dev again. Okay. And we already have preview open, so let's refresh. See if we get it running. Great. So we've got it running. And what we want to do is on index.svelte is we want to create a login button. So we're going to say login. And we just want to create a button. Login using GitHub. Simple enough. Okay. Now let's refresh our browser. And we've got a nice, beautiful looking login button. And we're pointing to this login endpoint. So with OAuth, we need to redirect to GitHub to a URL passing it our client ID, but we don't want to share our client ID on the client. We want to actually use that on the server. So we're going to use the endpoints feature of SvelteKit, and we're going to create a file called login.js. And this works similarly to a Express endpoint if you've used the Express framework. And it keeps putting these files over here. I want them over here. I want them over here. Okay. So with this, if we do /login, SvelteKit is going to be looking for a particular handler function in this file. In this case, a get. And you'll notice each function kind of matches the verb. So if the browser makes a request, we're going to export an async function called get, and it's going to take a request argument, which the request is very similar to the request in Node Express, but it is, really more similar to the fetch request API. And so this request object is going to come in, and then we're going to return an object that should represent the response. And in this case, we're just going to return the body hello. Okay. So now when I come over here, I'm going to refresh just to make sure, and then click login, I get hello. So when I click the login button, it just directs me to this endpoint, hello. Now, what we want to do is we want to build a redirect URL. So we want to redirect to GitHub for authorization. So in order to do that, we need the target that we want to go to. So target, and it's going to be equal to HTTPS github.com login OAuth authorize. Right? And from that target, we need to pass it a couple of things. We need to pass it our client ID, and we need to pass it a state. So let's pull the client ID from our environment. So meta.env.byte client ID. And then we're just going to make up a state for right now for demo purposes. So we're going to call this our session ID, and we're just going to give it a string of 1, 2, 3, 4. Woo! Now we're going to tell SvelteKit to redirect to this new target. So we're going to give it a status code of 302, which anything in the 300s means to redirect. And then in the headers, we're going to give it a location property. And that location property is going to be our target and client ID as a query param. And that's going to have the value of client ID. And then we're going to add another query param, and we'll call that state. And that's going to have the value of session ID. Okay. So now since I'm running in Gitpod, I need to change my OAuth settings a little bit because the URL that it is actually on is a little bit different than if you were running this on your local machine. So here, the URL is like beige narwhal, blah, blah, blah. So I need to go and change my application settings to that URL. Right? And the same thing with my callback. There. All right. So I think I'm good to go. Now, if everything works out, this will redirect me to the login of the GitHub OAuth application. So when I click login using GitHub, you just refresh just to make sure everything's loaded. Great. So now it's taken my client and it recognizes this app, Authy, and it's asking if I want to authorize. And if I hit authorize, Authy will be able to see any of my public data. That's it. And that's all we want it to see. So let's select authorize. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to try to call callback. but callback doesn't exist and it's passing this code. So that's our next step, is that we need to handle that callback coming back from GitHub. And I'm going to see if this simple browser works, because that'll be easier than switching back and forth. Nah, I didn't think it would work. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know why it won't work. We'll just switch back and forth. It's simple. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and check that in. So we'll create another branch. We'll call it 2 dash login. Let's call it login endpoint. Okay. And we'll add our new login endpoint. And we'll commit. And we'll push to GitHub. Cool. Okay. So now we need to add a callback endpoint. Just like we did with the login endpoint, we're going to create a new file in source routes. We're going to call it callback.js. And callback is actually going to get called from the GitHub endpoint, but we need to catch it with the same handler that we added for the login.js file. Export a sync function get, we'll get a request back. And then what we want to return is some response, right? Like that. Now, in this callback, we do a couple of things. One is we need to get an access token. So we're going to get a code, and we're going to use that code in our client and secret ID and make another call to GitHub to give us an access token. So that'll be this three-legged handshake with the identity server so that we can access the API. So we're going to do client ID equals import meta environment by client ID. And then we're going to do secret equals import.meta.env by client secret. Cool. So that'll give us our client ID and our secret. And we need to use a library to make this request. And we could use so many different libraries. Can use Node's HTTP client library. We could use Axios, or we could use Fetch. I'm choosing to use Fetch because that is the library that I am the most familiar with. And we're going to import that from Node Fetch. Okay. So we want to install that as a dependency. And then we need the target URL that we're going to call to get the token. So let's just call this token URL. And that's going to be https github.com login OAuth access token. All right, I think we have everything we need. What I'm going to do is abstract it out and say await get token. Now we need a code. right? So let's get our code, and we'll get that from the request.query.get code. So the nice thing with this request is it already parses using the URL search params, parses the search parameter line, and we can just get it with the get method, and it should return us the code. And now we can just pass that in our get token function. So let's go ahead and create the token function. So it's just going to be a function called get token with the code as an argument, and it's going to return a fetch using the token URL. And we want to do a post on this token URL. So we're going to do a post. We need to pass some headers. We need to pass content type. We're going to send some application JSON as our body. And we want to accept application JSON. Right? And those are all the headers we want to send. Finally, we need to send a body. And that body, we're going to go ahead and stringify. And it's going to be the client ID. And that'll be our client ID. And the client secret. And that'll be our secret. And then finally, our code. Okay. And when it comes back, it's going to come back as a response. So we want to handle that here and do a then and convert that body of that response to JSON. And then we're going to just pop off that body of response will have a couple of different properties. And what we're going to do is get the access token property. So we're just going to call r.access token. And you may want to dig in further to look at all the other properties, especially if you want to use the GitHub API for stuff. You can, change the scope of your app and get certain things. But we're just using it for authentication now. So all we care about is kind of that access token. And that's going to return back to token here. And let's just go ahead and show the token like that. Okay. Now let's fire up our dev server. And yeah, we'll go to our tab over here where we have it running. Look, we already got a token, but we can start from the beginning. And we log in using GitHub and we get a token. Pretty cool. So that works great. And then the next thing is we want to get the user info. Now that we have the access token, we can get the user information. So our next point of business is get access token, get user. So we'll say await get user token. Okay. And we'll build our get user function, which is really just a wrapper around the fetch, but this is a little cleaner. So we'll take the token and we'll just do return fetch, and we need the API URL of the user. So we're going to create that. So we'll do user URL. And that's going to be https api.github.com/user. Okay. Pretty straightforward. So we'll use user URL, and we're going to give it some headers, mainly accept. What we will accept is JSON back, and we want to authorize this request with a bearer token and our token. Okay. And then we want to grab the response. Okay. So finally, up here, we're going to do JSON, stringify user, comma, null, comma, 2. Maybe that'll give us a simple pretty print here. Okay, so we've got our main screen. We hit login using GitHub, and when it comes back, we get the user. So we actually get the login user with all the public information. Pretty cool. We are making progress. We have logged into GitHub using our application, but we don't want to print the user. We want to kind of store that in a session so then we can protect other endpoints in our application. But let's go ahead and create a branch here before we get into cookies and sessions. So we're going to check out -b, and this is number 3. We'll call it callback. And we're gonna do a get and try to do a get status, not a gut status, a get status. And we want to add source routes callback JS and commit. And our commit message will be added callback handlers, and we'll push this to our current branch. All right, let's go ahead and fire up. Well, we're going to have to install some things, so let's don't do that yet. Okay, so that's our callback. Pretty cool. We get a code back from GitHub, then we call GitHub to give us an access token, and then we use that token to get our user. And now we're just sort of printing the user out, but what we really want to do is set up a session, and we're going to just use the user login information as a unique identifier to indicate that there's a session, so we can kind of store it on the cookie, and it will be public information, but it won't be anything that anyone could use to access anything. So it's a good way to demo this. In order to do that, we need some way to kind of capture the requests coming in and then also be able to modify the requests coming out. Commonly, this is kind of referred to as middleware. In SvelteKit, it's in a file called hooks, and that file is in the source directory. So we're going to create a new file called hooks.js. And in that new file, we're going to create a handler called export sync function handle. And this handler will be a middleware kind of feature where we can do some stuff before the request goes to one of our endpoints. And then when it's resolved, we can do some stuff after. So when the handle gets called, it gives us an object, and on that object, we have a request object and a resolve function. What we're going to do is do some stuff before and then do some stuff after. And at the end of the day, we're going to return a response. And to get our response, we're going to call await resolve request. And that function actually will do all the processing that's going on now. So that function will, depending on the route, go to the right route, whether it's login, index, or callback. And that's going to happen when we call resolve request. So here we can kind of do stuff before that, and here we can do stuff after. So the first thing we want to do is set a cookie. So after this response, we want to set an HTTP only cookie, which can only be modified in the server, but does go to the client and comes back. So we're going to call response.headers, and we're going to say set cookie, and we're going to set that equal to a string. And that string is going to have a user, and we're going to need something here. And then it's going to have a path, and that's going to be equal to root. So that just means, put this cookie on every single path on the origin. And then we're going to set it to HTTP only. And that's very important because we do not want people to be able to change the value here. So we need a way to set this user up. So when we do the login, we can actually mutate the request locals object and set it, give it some properties. And that's what we'll do is we're going to, kind of mutate the request locals object and put a user property on it. Then once we've got the user property set, we're going to once we have the user property set, we'll set the cookie. So now we need to kind of go into our callback and set this request.users object. So then the last thing we're going to say is if it's not set, let's set it to empty. That way we can kind of reset the user when logout response happens. Okay. Cool. So what we need to do is go back into our callback, and we want to set our request dot locals dot user equal to user dot login, like that. And then instead of returning a body here, we're going to actually do a redirect. So we're going to say status 302, and we're going to say headers location, and we're just going to redirect to the main page. Okay, pretty cool. So when we redirect there, we're going to come back to the hooks, and it's going to set this response, and then we're going to add the set cookie, and then we're going to have the response here. Now, we need to make sure the cookie's being set, and there's a couple ways to do that. So what we're going to do is install a module called cookie, which just gives us some nice parsing routines. And we're going to import that in our hooks file. And then up here, before we process the response, we're going to parse that cookie. So we're going to say request headers cookie, and if that doesn't exist, we're just going to set this to empty. Okay. And then just to see how we're doing here, let's go ahead and just console. Well, let's do, yeah, console log user, and we're going to say cookies.user like that. Okay. Okay, that should give us enough to see how this thing works or to debug any bugs that we created here. All right, so we're running our server. And now if we go back to the main page, we should get, our button, and we click our button. We're going to do our authentication. It's going to go to the callback. It's going to set the cookie, and then it's going to come back to the screen. So if everything works right, it's going to look like nothing happened, right? Go figure. So let's try that. Log in, we click, does some stuff, and it comes back here. So that's a good sign. That means nothing happened. And here we're logging this user cookie, and you can see it's undefined, it's empty, empty, and oh, there it is, T Wilson 63. So the cookie was set, and when it came back a second time to show the main page from the redirect, we can see that it's set in this cookie users thing. So that's great. Now we need to kind of pass it around. And the easiest way to do that is to use this request locals.user object. So we're going to say request.locals.user equals cookies.user, right? And now we can kind of pass that around. So now when we go to another page, we can access that as a session. But there's one more step to get there, and that's still in this hooks file. We need to add what's called a get session function. And this get session function basically allows us to pull anything from the request and add it in a little session object so that it's just easier to get at in our page routes. So let's create that. Get session request, right? And then we're just going to return an object. We're going to say user equals request.locals.user. Okay. And that just is just really a nice wrapper. So when we do a page load, we can just pull the session object and get our user. Pretty cool. Okay. Now, let's go to our index page, and if the user is logged in, let's hide the login from with GitHub button and show a logout button. That would be pretty cool. So what we want to do, we'll kind of work backwards here. We're going to use a Svelte directive, and we'll say if the user is there, then what we want to do is show, I don't know, hey, welcome, and maybe the user. And then we'll do another href log out and a button in there and call it log out. We'll do an else, and then we'll say login, right? Okay. So user's not defined. Okay. So now we need to do a script. And in that script, we're going to export let user like that, which is cool. So now we need to get the user. And in order to get the user, we're going to use the script context equals module, which will actually execute on the server. And we're going to take our async function, load. We're going to get the session. And that session comes straight from that Git session. And then we're going to just return some props. And we'll call it user and set it to session user, like that. Pretty cool. So if all that worked, we should see my login name on the main page. So if we hit refresh, and we don't. So let's log in with GitHub, and we do. Cool. So welcome, T Wilson 63, and then we have logout, which logout is not found. Pretty cool. And now if we refresh, we're logged in, right? Which is really nice. Okay. So let's go ahead and check that code in because it's working. It's always good to check in code when it's working. I'm going to call this number 4. Let's just make sure I don't lose count. Yeah. So we'll check out a new branch and we'll call it 4 dot session cookie, and we'll add source hooks, and then we'll commit. And we'll push like so. Cool. Okay. So we got a logout button. Let's implement a logout endpoint handler. And that's super easy. You probably have an idea of how to do that now. So in our routes folder, we create a logout.js file. And in that logout.js file, we're going to export a sync function called get. And it's going to take a request object. And what we want to do is get our locals user, and let's just clear it out. Let's set it to null. And then we're going to do another redirect, right? Return status 302 headers location, and let's see, we want to just go back to the home page, right? Okay, so that's going to clear out that local user. Then it's going to come into our hooks handle method, and in this case local user will be null, so that's going to make it blank. So set cookie will blank out the username, return the response, and then when it reloads the home page, it's going to parse the cookie header and it's going to find that it's blank. So this cookies will be undefined, and we could just make it a little bit clearer. Let's say instead of blank here, we could say user equals null, like that. And then that's going to set locals to null. And then when we go to index.svelte, it's going to have session.user equal to null. Let's go back one. I think I skipped one. So that's local user is set to null. And then index is set to null. User set to null. If user should return false, so then we should get our login button back. So if all that works, we should have a logout. Okay. So let's go to our main screen. If we refresh, we're still logged in. We click logout, and it all worked. So now we've got our login. We click login again. We log in. You can log out. Pretty cool. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and just, even though that wasn't a lot of code, let's go ahead and create a branch. And so we have it well defined. And call it 5 logout. Super simple. Get status. I need to add source. Oops, just running out of typing skills today. Logout. Okay. Git commit. And then we'll say added logout endpoint. And we'll push to the current branch. Cool. Okay. So that's pretty much it. The one last thing I want to show you is how you might go about protecting a list of routes, right? So you may have a set of routes like an admin section or a specific section that you want to protect, or maybe specific routes you want to protect, or vice versa. You may only want some routes unprotected and everything else protected. So instead of going to each page and doing a check, like if user, you know, every single time, you can take advantage of the SvelteKit layout page, which wraps all the pages in the route. So we can create a new file and we do underscore underscore layout.js. And this file actually wraps around all of the page requests. So it's just a component. So we can give it a script of context equals module, and we can give it a slot. And everything in that slot will be the whole page being rendered. And in our context module, we can export an async function called load and pull the page and session objects. And then we can, like, for example, if we wanted to protect everything with slash admin, we can just basically, you know, do this. If, um, well, oh yeah, it's not layout.js, it's layout.svelte because it's a Svelte component. Much better. Okay, so basically what we're doing here is um, if the page.path starts with slash admin and something else, and session user is empty, right? Um, and we could change that and say, because we know session user will be null, so we can just say not equal to null. Or we can say is session user, whatever we want to do. Actually, if it's admin and session user is null, right? Then we want to redirect to the home page. Otherwise, go through and we'll just return props and then it'll go to each individual page and do whatever it needs to do. So that's kind of how you can protect your pages using this mode of authentication. And let's see. Now it might not work with this demo because we don't have an admin page. Let's see. So we go admin. We could create one. Yeah. Yeah. So we would have to create one, blah, blah, blah. But I think you get the point. And you can definitely play around with it. But if we go home and we log in and then we go to an admin page, we can check that. And you can definitely play around with that and see how it goes. And you can do all kinds of things. We're just using a regex and test, but you could do an array of paths and do an includes, whatever you want to do there. But that should give you some idea on how you can protect your routes. And then your endpoints, you can protect them as well just by looking at the request.locals value and seeing if the user exists. So it turns out that it gives you a very clean and easy way to protect your secure endpoints using this method. Um, so let's go ahead and check out our final branch here. Um, let me see what branch we are on. We're on 5. So check out -B6. Protect endpoints. All right, added protect endpoint example. And we can push up our branch. And cool. So that concludes the workshop. Hopefully you learned something. There will be a post that goes through the same process if you just check the description. And again, I think it's really cool, really well done how the SvelteKit team has put together kind of this really nice, well thought out process between server and client and allow you to operate in both contexts within components and endpoints and give you just a really simple kind of set of functions in this hooks object to manage kind of some of these pieces. So give it a try. Let me know what you think. And yeah, I hope you have fun with it. Thanks for your time. See you later.